I spent a decade sacrificing everything to raise two abandoned children with my grease-stained hands. But when my niece found fame, my brother suddenly returned to claim custody, hiding a terrifying secret. He had secretly forced a massive debt onto his 5-year-old son just to save himself. Every morning at 4:45, the alarm clock on my bedside table screams like a wounded bird. I do not reach for it with the grace of a man who is well rested. I reach for it with fingers that are stiff and joints that ache from a decade of wrestling with rusted bolts and heavy engines. I am Jack Harrison, and 34 years of life have left me with little more than a persistent cough and a collection of scars that map out my history. My apartment on the edge of Cleveland is small. The walls are thin enough that I can hear the neighbor's television, and the air always carries a faint scent of damp wood and old cooking oil. I drink my coffee black. It is cheap bitter and hot enough to burn the sleep out of my eyes. That first swallow is the only thing that reminds me I am alive before the world demands I start moving. Miller's garage is where I spend the daylight hours. It is a cavernous space filled with the smell of gasoline and the constant rhythmic clank of metal hitting metal. My boss, Mr. Miller, is a man of few words and even fewer raises. He values hard work, but he values his profit margins more. I do not complain. I have a roof over my head and a set of tools that feel like extensions of my own arms. By noon, my hands are black with grease that no soap can truly remove. The skin is cracked around the knuckles, permanent maps of red and gray etched into my palms. It is honest work. There's a certain peace in a broken machine. A car does not lie to you. If it does not start, there is a reason. If it leaks, there is a hole. Life outside the garage is messy and full of questions without answers. But inside these walls, everything can be fixed if you have enough patience and the right wrench. Sometimes, when the shop is quiet and the sunlight filters through the grime on the high windows, I see it. I see a different sign hanging over a different door. It would be made of solid oak, the letters carved deep and painted in gold. Harrison and Sons Auto Repair. I imagine a waiting room with chairs that do not have holes in the vinyl. I imagine a ceiling fan that does not wobble and a floor that stays clean for more than an hour. It is a distant dream, a flickering light at the end of a very long tunnel, but it is the reason I do not stop. I want to build something that belongs to me. I want to be the man who makes the decisions, the man who does not have to ask for permission to take a lunch break. When the sun goes down and the city lights flicker to life, I return to my quiet rooms. I do not go out for drinks with the other mechanics. I do not spend my money on new clothes or fancy gadgets. Instead, I kneel by the side of my twin bed and reach into the shadows. I pull out a heavy iron box. It is cold to the touch and smells of old metal. Inside that box is my future, built penny by penny and dollar by dollar. $18,450. I know the number by heart. I count the bills every Sunday night, smoothing out the wrinkled edges of the 5s and 10s. It is the cost of my sweat. It is the price of every Saturday I worked overtime while the rest of the world was at the park. It is not enough to buy a building yet, but it is enough to keep the hope alive. I live a solitary life. My family is a memory I try not to visit too often. My parents live 2 hours away in Akron, but we have not spoken in years. They always looked at me as the son who would never amount to much, the one who was content to get his hands dirty while my younger brother Shane was the star. Shane was the one with the silver tongue, the one who could sell a bridge to a man who lived in a desert. I do not envy him. I have my tools, my box, and my dream. I thought this was how my story would end, a quiet man in a quiet room waiting for his chance to finally begin. But the universe has a way of throwing a wrench into even the most carefully timed engine. I did not know that my life was about to be dismantled piece by piece, and that the clank of fate was already echoing down the hallway toward my door. The rain outside was not a gentle autumn drizzle. It was a cold, violent downpour that lashed against the thin glass of my window like gravel. I had just returned from a 12-hour shift at the garage. My body felt as though it had been beaten with a hammer. I sat at my small kitchen table, still wearing my oil-stained coveralls, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee. The silence of the apartment was heavy, filled only with the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the distant rumble of city traffic. Then came the knock. It was not a polite tap. It was a frantic, desperate pounding that shook the door in its frame. I stood up my knees, protesting with every inch, and walked toward the sound. When I pulled the door open, the hallway light spilled over a ghost. Shane stood there, my younger brother, whom I had not seen or heard from in 8 long years. He looked as though he belonged in a different world. He was wearing a charcoal wool overcoat and a silk tie, his leather shoes polished to a high shine despite the rain. He looked successful, wealthy, and completely terrified. I stood before him in my filth, the smell of gasoline and old sweat clinging to my skin. I was the rough earth of reality, and he was the polished glass of a life I did not understand. He was not alone. In his arms he held a sleeping toddler wrapped in a pink blanket. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess against his shoulder. Tugging at his coat sleeve was a small boy who could not have been more than 5 years old. The boy was shivering, wearing a thin jacket that was useless against the Cleveland wind. "Jack," Shane said, his voice thin and cracking, "I am in a bind. I have a major real estate project in Chicago. It is a huge deal, Jack. It is the kind of thing that changes everything. But I cannot take the kids. It is just for a few days. Please, you are the only one I can trust." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him where he had been when our mother died, or why he had never answered a single one of my letters. But Shane did not wait for an answer. He pushed past me into the cramped living room and set the sleeping girl Ruby down on my bed. He dropped a tattered duffel bag on the floor. It was bulging with diapers and a few mismatched pieces of clothing. "I'll be back by Friday," Shane said, backing toward the door, as if the room were on fire. "I just need to get this settled. I will make it up to you, Jack. I will pay you back for everything. I swear on my life." He did not look me in the eye. I had known that tone of voice since we were children. It was the sound of a hollow promise. It was the lie of a man who was running away from a debt he could not pay. Before I could find the words to stop him, he was gone. He did not even stoop down to hug his son. He simply turned and ran down the creaky stairs. A moment later, I heard the roar of an expensive engine as his sedan sped away into the darkness of the storm. I stood in the center of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The apartment felt smaller than ever. I looked down at the boy Brooks. He was standing exactly where his father had left him, his small hands curled into fists at his sides. He did not cry. He did not scream for his father to come back. He did not even whimper. Brooks looked up at me, and my breath caught in my throat. His eyes were not the eyes of a 5-year-old child. They were wide and terrifyingly still, like the eyes of a small wounded animal that had been abandoned on the side of a busy highway. There was a hollow ancient kind of fear in his gaze, a deep silent understanding that the person he was supposed to trust had simply vanished. He looked at my grease-stained hands and my tired face, searching for something I was not sure I possessed. That look pierced through me more sharply than any metal shard ever had. In that moment, the exhaustion in my bones disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard realization. I was no longer just a mechanic waiting for a dream to start. I was the only thing standing between these two children and an indifferent world. I looked at Brooks, and I knew right then that I could not turn my back. I could not be like our parents, and I certainly could not be like Shane. I took a deep breath, reached out a hand, and whispered that everything would be okay, even though I did not yet believe the words myself. The first 48 hours were a blur of panic and exhaustion. I discovered very quickly that a 2-year-old child is far more complicated than a combustion engine. When Ruby woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, screaming with a hunger that seemed to shake the very foundations of my apartment, I found myself standing in the kitchen staring at a plastic canister of formula as if it were a foreign repair manual. My hands, which could disassemble a transmission in the dark, were trembling. I set the bottle down on a clean paper towel and spread out the instructions on the counter. I treated it like a technical schematic. I measured the water to the exact milliliter, checked the temperature of the liquid with a digital thermometer I usually used for radiator coolant, and leveled the powder with the precision of a machinist. I realized then that I was trying to solve a human problem with a mechanic's logic, but it was the only way I knew how to survive. By the third day, Friday came and went with no sign of Shane. His phone was disconnected and the silence from his end was deafening. I had no choice but to take the children with me to Miller's garage. I could not afford a babysitter and I could not risk losing my job. I went to a second-hand store and bought a heavy canvas baby carrier that strapped around my torso. When I walked into the shop that morning, the other mechanics stopped their work and stared. I had Ruby strapped to my back, her small head bobbing just above my shoulder blades, and I was holding Brooks by the hand. The garage was a sensory assault. The air was thick with the scent of burnt oil and the sharp tang of degreaser. I spent the morning underneath a rusted Chevrolet Silverado, lying on a creeper with the cold concrete pressing against my spine. Every time I reached up to wrench a bolt loose, I felt Ruby shift against my back. She was surprisingly quiet, fascinated by the swinging shop lights and the shadows on the ceiling, but when she did cry, the sound was piercing. It was a strange, dissonant symphony. The high-pitched wail of a hungry toddler would rise up only to be drowned out by the thunderous staccato burst of my pneumatic impact wrench. I would pull the trigger, the air gun screaming as it forced a lug nut free, and for a few seconds the mechanical violence would mask the sound of my own rising desperation. Brooks was like a shadow. He sat on an old wooden crate in the corner of my bay, clutching a plastic truck I had found in the discard pile. He did not move, and he did not complain. He watched me with those same wide, haunting eyes, tracking every move I made with a wrench or a screwdriver. I felt a heavy weight in my chest every time I looked at him. A 5-year-old boy should be running in a park, not sitting in a dark, oily garage watching his uncle struggle to keep his head above water. I expected Mr. Miller to fire me the moment he saw the children. He was a hard man who did not tolerate distractions. He walked into my bay around noon, his heavy boots crunching on the metal shavings. He stood there for a long time, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar, watching me struggle to balance a heavy brake rotor while Ruby kicked her legs against my ribs. I waited for the lecture. I waited for him to tell me to pack my tools and leave. Instead, Mr. Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean rag. He walked over to Brooks and handed him a small sealed bag of beef jerky and a cold bottle of apple juice from the vending machine. He looked at me, his eyes hidden behind his grease-stained spectacles, and nodded toward the back of the shop. "The old office in the back is empty," Mr. Miller said, his voice gravelly and low. "It has a door that locks. Bring a blanket from home. It is better for the boy to sit in there than on a crate. And Jack, make sure you do not get oil on that baby's blanket. It will never come out." He did not wait for a thank you. He simply turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched. It was the closest thing to a blessing I had ever received. That afternoon the work felt slightly lighter, though my back was screaming in protest. I realized that my dream of Harrison and Sons was no longer just about a sign on a door. It was about survival. I was a man who fixed things, and for the first time in my life I was trying to fix a family that had been broken long before it reached my doorstep. I was tired, I was covered in filth, and I was terrified. But as I felt Ruby fall asleep against my back, the steady rhythm of her breathing matching the heartbeat in my own ears, I knew I would not let them fall. If I could keep a 20-year-old engine running on nothing but prayer and spare parts, I could surely find a way to keep these children safe. The winter in Cleveland does not care about your heart. It only cares about how much you can afford to pay the utility companies and the local grocer. Within 2 months of Shane's disappearance, the modest rhythm of my life had been shattered. A single man, living in a drafty apartment, can survive on canned soup and overtime, but 2 growing children require a different kind of math. Brooks needed warm boots for the slushy sidewalks, and Ruby seemed to outgrow her clothes every 3 weeks. But the real blow came from the systems that govern the world outside the garage. Brooks needed to be enrolled in school, and Ruby required her childhood vaccinations. In this country, that meant paperwork, and paperwork meant money I did not have in my checking account. The final straw was the health insurance. I could not keep them on a wing and a prayer anymore. Ruby had developed a persistent cough that sounded like gravel in a tin can, and the fear that it might turn into pneumonia kept me awake until the sun rose. I realized then that my pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. One Tuesday evening, after the children had fallen asleep on the bed we now all shared, I sat on the floor and reached into the darkness beneath the bed frame. I pulled out the iron box. The metal felt heavier than usual. I opened the lid, and the familiar scent of old paper and cold iron filled the air. I looked at the stacks of bills, each one representing a Saturday night I did not spend at the movies or a meal I did not eat. $18,450. This was the foundation of Harrison & Sons. This was the paint for the walls of my own shop, and the down payment on the hydraulic lift I had picked out in a catalog 3 years ago. I touched the top bundle of $20 bills with my grease-stained thumb. I felt a hollow ache in my chest as I pulled out $5,000 to cover the initial deposits for their insurance, and the private tutoring Brooks needed to catch up with his peers. My dream was not dying, but it was certainly changing color. It was fading from the bright gold of a new beginning to the dull bruised gray of survival. The following morning, I took Brooks to the administrative office of the local elementary school to finalize his registration. I had a folder tucked under my arm containing his birth certificate and the Social Security card Shane had left in the duffel bag. I felt a sense of accomplishment as I handed the documents to the clerk, a woman with tired eyes and a sharp haircut. I thought the hard part was over. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice trailing off as she stared at her computer screen. She tapped a few keys, her brow furrowing. "There is a flag on your nephew's file, a significant one." "A flag?" I asked, my heart beginning to thud against my ribs. "He is 5 years old. What kind of flag could he have?" She sighed and turned the monitor toward me. When I ran his Social Security number through the state verification system for the subsidized lunch program, it triggered a series of alerts. It appears that Brooks Harrison has an active credit history, a very long and very dark one. I stared at the screen, but the numbers did not make sense. I saw a list of high-interest payday loans, 3 different cellular phone contracts, and a series of delinquent payments for a luxury vehicle lease in Chicago. All of them were tied to the Social Security number of a child who was still learning how to tie his own shoes. The total debt was staggering, over $40,000 in unpaid balances and legal fees. "This is impossible," I whispered, my voice shaking. "He is a child?" "It is identity theft, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice softening with pity. "Usually it is a stranger, but looking at the dates, these accounts started being opened right after he was born. The addresses on the applications match the residential history of his biological father." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. I felt a surge of nausea so powerful I had to grip the edge of the desk. Shane had not just left his children on my doorstep because he was in a bind. He had spent the last 5 years systematically cannibalizing his own son's future to fund his expensive suits and his fast cars. He had treated Brooks like a bottomless bank account, knowing that a child would never check his own credit score until it was far too late. I looked at Brooks, who was sitting in a plastic chair in the corner swinging his legs and looking at a poster of the solar system. He had no idea that he was already a bankrupt man in the eyes of the law. He did not know that his own father had marked him as a failure before he even had a chance to try. The anger that rose up in me then was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was not the hot, quick temper of a man who had been cut off in traffic. It was a cold, obsidian rage that settled deep in my marrow. I realized that Shane was not just a coward or a flake. He was a predator. He had not abandoned them to give them a better life. He had abandoned them because he was finished using them. I stood up, took the paperwork back from the clerk, and walked over to Brooks. I knelt down and looked him in the eyes. I did not see a burden anymore. I did not see a nephew who had interrupted my plans. I saw a survivor of a war he did not know he was fighting. I realized then that my $18,000 were gone, and I would likely spend every other cent I ever earned fighting this. I was no longer just a mechanic trying to save a few bucks. I was a man at war with his own blood, and I would spend my last breath making sure that Shane never got the chance to steal another piece of this boy's soul. My dream of a garage was dead, but a new, fiercer purpose had taken its place. I was going to be the wall that Shane could never climb over again. The spring in Cleveland arrived not with flowers, but with a persistent cold wind that smelled of Lake Erie salt and wet asphalt. At Miller's garage, the heavy iron doors were finally propped open to let out the exhaust fumes, allowing a sliver of pale sunlight to cut through the haze of cigarette smoke and pulverized rust. It was during one of these quiet Tuesday afternoons while I was elbow-deep in the guts of a Ford transmission that the music began. It started as a low hum, a vibration that I thought was coming from a faulty air compressor. But then the hum sharpened into a melody, clear and steady, rising above the clinking of my wrenches. I pulled my arms out of the engine bay, wiping the black sludge onto a rag, and looked toward the back office. Ruby was sitting on a stack of tires, her small legs dangling, clutching a plastic doll. She was singing Jolene by Dolly Parton. I had heard that song on the radio 1,000 times, but I had never heard it like this. Her voice didn't sound like the voice of a 5-year-old. It possessed a haunting, resonant quality, a natural vibrato that seemed to vibrate against the metal toolboxes and the concrete floors. It was pure, unaffected, and filled with a strange kind of soul that made the entire garage fall silent. The other mechanics, men who usually communicated in grunts and curses, stopped what they were doing. Old Man Miller stepped out of his glass-walled office, his unlit cigar frozen in his mouth. For those 3 minutes, the smell of gasoline seemed to vanish, replaced by the vivid imagery of the Tennessee hills Ruby was singing about. When she finished, she simply went back to brushing her doll's hair, oblivious to the fact that she had just paralyzed 5 grown men with a single song. "Jack," Mr. Miller whispered, his voice more gravelly than usual. "That girl has a bell in her throat. You cannot let that go to waste." I knew he was right, but the realization terrified me. Talent like that was a lightning bolt, and I was just a man with a lightning rod made of rusted iron. That night, after the children were asleep, I walked to the local library and used one of their flickering computer terminals. I spent hours researching the music industry and the laws that governed child performers. I had seen enough movies to know that children with gifts were often treated like gold mines by the people who were supposed to protect them. I stumbled upon the California Child Actors Bill, commonly known as the Coogan Act. Although we were in Ohio, the principles haunted me. It was a law designed to ensure that the earnings of a child performer remained their own, protected in a blocked trust account that neither parents nor guardians could touch. I took detailed notes in my grease-stained ledger. I read about the Coogan Act that protects child performers in California, then called a legal aid hotline to ask what Ohio allows. A week later, I opened a court-restricted trust account in Ruby's name money that couldn't be touched for anything except her verified needs. If anyone tried to use her voice as a bank account, that they'd have to fight a judge first. I had already seen how Shane had used Brooks as a credit card. I would not allow history to repeat itself with Ruby's talent. But talent required cultivation, and cultivation required money. I looked at the remaining balance in my iron box. It was a bruised and battered sum. To afford a proper vocal coach in the city, I had to find a way to squeeze water from a stone. I began a regime of austerity that made my previous life look luxurious. I stopped buying coffee, entirely brewing a weak pot of brown water at home that tasted like cardboard. I stopped eating meat, surviving instead on large bags of rice and dried beans. I walked the 3 miles to the garage every morning to save the gasoline in my truck, leaving 2 hours before dawn so I would not be late. Every extra shift, every dirty job that the other mechanics refused, cleaning out the chemical vats or scraping the sludge from the floor drains, I took them all. My back felt like it was made of broken glass, and my eyes were constantly rimmed with red from the lack of sleep. But every time I handed the envelope of cash to Mrs. Gable, the vocal teacher, the pain receded. I watched through the small window of the music studio as Ruby learned to breathe from her diaphragm and reach the high notes without straining. She was a natural. She did not just sing the notes, she lived inside the stories of the songs. As I stood in the hallway smelling of motor oil and old sweat, I felt a strange, fierce pride. I was just a mechanic, a man whose life was defined by things that were broken, but I was helping to build something beautiful. I knew that Shane would eventually hear about her. Success in a city like Cleveland travels fast, and a voice like Ruby's was a beacon that would eventually draw the predators out of the shadows. I spent my nights studying legal jargon and financial regulations, preparing myself for a battle I knew was coming. I was not just protecting her voice, I was protecting her soul. My dream of owning a shop had been replaced by a much larger ambition. I wanted to be the man who ensured that Ruby's song never had to be a sad one. I was the guardian of the music now, and I would work myself into the grave before I let anyone steal the melody from her life. The local talent competition was held at the old community theater in downtown Cleveland, a building that smelled of dust velvet and a century of nervous dreams. Ruby stood on the stage in a simple white dress that I had stayed up until midnight to iron. When she began to sing an old folk ballad, the restless crowd went silent. Her voice did not just fill the room, it seemed to heal the cracks in the walls. I sat in the very back row, my grease-stained cap pulled low over my eyes, feeling a lump in my throat that I could not swallow. For the first time, the world was seeing what I had known all along. Ruby was not just a child with a hobby. She was a miracle. The local newspaper called her the little angel of the Rust Belt. Within 3 days, my telephone was ringing constantly. The attention culminated on a Thursday afternoon when a man named Marcus Sterling arrived at Miller's garage. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my truck and held a leather portfolio. He represented a regional talent agency with ties to Nashville. "Mr. Harrison," he said, handing me a document, "we want to sign Ruby to a development deal. We are prepared to offer a $50,000 signing bonus with more to follow once we start recording. This is a rare opportunity for a girl from her background." I looked at the number on the paper. $50,000. It was an astronomical sum, enough to pay off the debts Shane had attached to Brooks and still have enough left to finally open Harrison and Sons. But as I held the pen, I remembered the Coogan Act research I had done. I insisted that the contract be amended to include a protected trust account. I wanted to ensure that Ruby was the only person who would ever benefit from her gift. Mr. Sterling seemed surprised by my stubbornness, but he eventually agreed. The news of the contract spread through the city like a wildfire. I should have known that the light of success would attract the scavengers. 2 days after the news broke, I was finishing a brake job on a heavy-duty van. The afternoon sun was dimming when a sleek black European sedan pulled into the lot. The engine hummed with a quiet, expensive precision that did not belong in our neighborhood. The door opened and Shane stepped out. He looked different than the broken man who had fled into the rain 3 years ago. He wore a tailored navy suit and designer sunglasses. Beside him was a man with a sharp, angular face and a briefcase that looked like a weapon. This was not a brother coming home to visit. This was an invasion. "Jack," Shane said, spreading his arms as if we were old friends. "I saw the news. My little girl is a star. I am so proud of her. I have finally gotten my life together, brother. I have a penthouse in Chicago and a new business. I am here to take my children home." My blood turned to ice. I stepped forward, my heavy work boots crunching on the gravel. I was covered in the black soot of the garage, a stark contrast to his pristine appearance. "You're not taking anyone, Shane," I said, my voice low and steady. "You disappeared for years. You did not send a single dollar. You did not even send a birthday card. You are a stranger to them." The man beside Shane stepped forward. He did not smile. "Mr. Harrison, my name is Elias Vane. I represent Mr. Shane Harrison. We have filed a formal petition with the Cuyahoga County Court to terminate your temporary guardianship and restore full physical and legal custody to the biological father. The law is very clear on the rights of a natural parent who has established a stable residence." "Stable residence," I spat, looking at Shane. "We both know why you are here. You do not want the children. You want the $50,000. You want the girl with the golden voice so you can gamble away her future like you did with your son's credit." Shane's face hardened, the fake smile disappearing instantly. Be careful, Jack. You are just a mechanic living in a dump. You have no legal standing here. I am their father. I am the one who gave them life, and I am the one who will manage their careers. You've had your fun playing house, but the game is over. Mr. Vane handed me a thick folder of legal documents. We will see you in court on Monday morning, Mr. Harrison. I suggest you find a lawyer, though I doubt anyone on your salary can afford the kind of representation you will need to win this. They turned and walked back to their expensive car without even asking to see Brooks or Ruby. As the sedan sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in the air, I stood alone in the center of the lot. My hands were shaking, but it was not from fear. It was from the realization that the shadow of my brother had finally caught up to us. He did not see the two beautiful souls I had raised. He saw 2 paychecks. I looked at the grease on my hands and then at the legal papers in my grip. I knew that the battle ahead would be the hardest fight of my life. Shane had the money and the lawyers, but I had the truth. I went into the back office and looked at Brooks, who was helping Ruby with her homework. They looked at me with such trust that it broke my heart. I realized then that I would sell my soul before I let Shane dim the light in their eyes. The shadow was back, but I was the one who knew how to work in the dark. I would fight him with every breath I had left. The weekend following the encounter at the garage felt like a slow-motion car crash. The legal documents sat on my kitchen table, a heavy white stack of paper that seemed to radiate a cold, malevolent energy. I could not stop looking at them. I could not stop thinking about the polished floors of a Chicago penthouse versus the cracked linoleum of my kitchen. Shane was not just fighting me in a courtroom. He was fighting me for the hearts and minds of the children, and he was using a currency I did not possess. On Saturday morning, a delivery truck pulled up to the curb. A man in a crisp uniform carried 3 large, glossy boxes up the creaking stairs. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed over my chest as he laid them on my floor. Brooks and Ruby huddled behind me, their eyes wide with curiosity. "A gift from your father," the delivery man said before turning to leave. Inside the boxes was a world I could never provide. There was a high-end gaming console for Brooks, a tablet for Ruby, and a collection of designer clothes that looked like they belonged in a magazine. There were boxes of expensive chocolates, and a handwritten note on thick, creamy stationery that read, "This is just a small taste of the life you deserve. I will see you soon. Love, Dad." I watched as Brooks touched the sleek surface of the gaming console. I saw the way Ruby held a silk dress against her small frame, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of wonder and confusion. I felt a sharp, bitter pang in my chest. I had spent my life savings on vaccines and tutoring things they could not see or touch. Shane had spent a few $100s on toys and silk, and in their eyes he was becoming a hero. I wanted to tell them that the toys were bought with stolen credit, but how do you tell a child that their father is a thief without breaking their heart? The psychological pressure intensified that evening when my telephone rang. I saw the Akron area code and felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. It was my mother. I had not heard her voice in over a year, but she did not start with a greeting. "Jack, what is wrong with you?" she demanded, her voice sharp and brittle over the line. "Your brother called us. He told us you are being spiteful. He said you are trying to block him from seeing his own children." "Mother, you do not understand," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "Shane is not what he seems. He used Brooks' Social Security number to run up $40,000 in debt. He abandoned them for 3 years. He's only back because Ruby has a contract." "Shane said that was a misunderstanding with his business partners," she snapped, dismissing my words as if they were nothing. "He is successful now, Jack. He has a penthouse. He has connections in the music industry. He can give Ruby a career that you could never dream of. You are just a mechanic. Why are you trying to drag them down into the dirt with you? Why are you standing in the way of his success?" I realized then that she had never changed. To her, Shane was the golden child who had made something of himself, and I was the disappointment who spent his days covered in oil. She did not care about the truth. She only cared about the appearance of success. "He is their father, Jack. my father added, having picked up the extension. "You have no right to keep those children in that run-down apartment. Do not be selfish. Let them go where they can have a real future. If you keep this up, do not bother coming to Akron ever again." The line went dead. I sat in the darkness of the kitchen, the silence of the apartment feeling like a physical weight. I looked around at my home. I saw the yellowed wallpaper peeling at the corners. I smelled the faint, inescapable scent of motor oil that seemed to have soaked into the very floorboards. I looked at the twin bed where the children slept, a piece of furniture I had scavenged from a yard sale. For the first time since the children arrived, a cold, suffocating despair began to take hold of me. I began to wonder if my parents were right. Was I being selfish? Was I keeping them here in this cramped, oily life just because I was lonely? Brooks deserved a yard to play and not a concrete lot filled with rusted mufflers. Ruby deserved to be in a world where her voice was celebrated, not hidden in a back office of a garage. I looked at my hands in the dim light. They were rough, scarred, and permanently stained. I was just a mechanic. I was a man who fixed things that were already broken. But as I looked at the expensive toys Shane had sent, I realized I could not fix a man like him. I fell into a dark hole of self-doubt, wondering if the best thing I could do for the children was to step aside and let them have the luxury Shane promised, even if it was built on a foundation of lies. I felt smaller than I ever had, a man of grease and bone fighting a ghost of silk and gold. I lay down on my mattress on the floor, listening to the children breathe, and for the first time I felt truly defeated. The despair did not last. On Sunday morning, I looked at Brooks as he tried to fix a broken toy with a piece of tape, his face set in the same determined expression I saw in the mirror every morning. I realized that giving up was not an option. If I let Shane take them, I was not giving them a better life. I was throwing them into a den of wolves. I needed more than just my word against his. I needed hard, undeniable facts. I took a bus to Chicago. I had the address from the legal papers Elias Vane had served me. It was a glass tower that overlooked the gray waters of Lake Michigan. I felt like a soot-stained thumb in a room full of diamonds as I stood in the lobby. I did not ask for Shane. I asked for the woman I had seen with him, the woman the lawyer had called his wife. Her name was Elena. I found her in a small cafe nearby. She was sitting alone, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Up close, without the harsh lights of the courtroom, she did not look like a predator. She looked like a woman who was waiting for a storm to break. When I sat down across from her, she did not call security. She simply sighed. "You are the brother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The mechanic." "I am the one who has been raising his children while he was playing millionaire," I replied. "I need to know the truth, Elena. I know Shane. I know he does not have a penthouse and a business unless he stole them from someone else." She looked around the cafe nervously, her hands trembling as she pulled a thick manila envelope from her designer handbag. "He did not steal them from someone else, Jack. He stole them from everyone. He did not marry me because he loved me. He married me because my father owns a shipping company. He used our name to secure loans for a real estate project that never existed." She pushed the envelope toward me. I opened it and felt the world go cold. Inside were court docket printouts, a bail order, and notices of account freezes, all with case numbers and dates. It wasn't rumor. It was paper you could verify. "Shane is not stable, Jack," Elena said, her eyes filling with tears. "He's under investigation for a massive wire fraud scheme. They froze his accounts 3 weeks ago. The penthouse is being foreclosed upon. The car is a rental he has not paid for in months. He is facing 20 years in federal prison." I scanned the documents, my eyes stopping on a highlighted section. "What does he want with Ruby?" "The bail," she whispered. "The judge set his bail at $250,000. He needs a significant down payment to a bondsman just to stay out of jail while the trial proceeds. He heard about Ruby's talent and that $50,000 signing bonus. He does not want to be a father. He wants a sacrificial lamb. He plans to sign her contract, take the advance, and use it to buy his freedom. Once the money is gone, he will disappear again, and he will leave those children with whoever is left standing. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. My brother was not just a thief. He was a monster who was willing to sell his own daughter's future to stay out of a cell for a few more months. He was going to use Ruby's gift, the voice I had worked so hard to protect, to pay for his crimes. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked. "Because I saw the way you looked at them in that courtroom," Elena said, standing up. "And because I know what happens to people who stay in the orbit of Shane. I am leaving him tonight. I am going back to my family. Take that folder, Jack. Go to the court. Do not let him destroy those kids the way he destroyed me." She walked away, leaving me with the weight of the truth in my hands. I looked at the Federal Bureau of Investigation documents and the bank seizure notices. The shiny veneer of the life of Shane was nothing but a thin layer of gold paint over a rotting corpse. I felt a surge of energy that I had not felt in years. The despair was gone, replaced by cold, surgical precision. I was a mechanic, and I finally had the right tools to take the engine of Shane apart piece by piece. I caught the next bus back to Cleveland, clutching the folder against my chest. The fight was no longer about who had more money. It was about who was standing on the side of the light. Shane was coming for the kids, but he did not know that I was coming for him, and I was bringing the federal government with me. The air inside the Cuyahoga County courtroom was thick with the scent of floor wax and old paper. It was a cold, sterile environment that felt completely alien to a man who spent his life surrounded by the heat of engines and the smell of exhaust. I sat at the petitioner's table wearing the same worn suit, my hands resting flat on the polished wood. I looked at my fingernails where the black grease of a decade was permanently etched into the skin. Across the aisle, Shane sat with Elias Vane. Shane looked like a king in exile, leaning back with a smirk of absolute confidence. He believed that the world belonged to people who looked like him and that a mechanic stood no chance against a man with a silk tie. Elias Vane stood up first. His voice was smooth-cultured and devoid of any real humanity. He spoke at length about the sacred rights of the biological parent. He used phrases like material advantage and optimal developmental environment. He showed the judge glossy photographs of the penthouse in Chicago and spoke about the private schools and international travel that Shane could provide. To the law, it sounded like a perfect plan. Vane painted a picture of a successful father returning to rescue his children from a life of poverty and manual labor. He made my apartment sound like a prison and my garage sound like a graveyard for dreams. When it was my turn to speak, I did not have a prepared legal argument. I did not have a leather briefcase. I stood up, feeling the weight of the manila envelope I had brought from Chicago. I looked at the judge, a man with gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of sorrow. "Your Honor." I began, my voice sounding rough and out of place in the quiet room. "Mr. Vane has spent a lot of time talking about the house that Shane owns. He has talked about the square footage and the view of the lake. But a house is just a structure made of glass and steel. It is a place where you keep your things. It is not a home." I stepped forward, my boots heavy on the floor. I do not have a penthouse. I have a small apartment with peeling wallpaper and a kitchen that smells like motor oil. But in that apartment there is a boy who no longer has to wonder if he will be fed. There is a girl who sings because she is happy, not because she has a paycheck. A home is not built with a mortgage. It is built with every hour I spent underneath a truck so I could pay for a vaccine. It is built with the $18,000 I saved for 10 years and gave up without a second thought because my children needed a future more than I needed a sign with my name on it. I walked to the bench and handed the judge the manila envelope. Shane is not here because he wants a home. He is here because he needs a bank. Inside that folder, you will find documents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will find that the penthouse is being foreclosed upon and that Shane is under investigation for a massive wire fraud. He is not a successful businessman. He is a man facing 20 years in prison, and he wants to use the singing contract of his daughter to pay his legal fees and his bail. He did not come back for them. He came back for what he could take from them. The courtroom went silent. Shane stood up, his face turning a deep angry red, but Elias Vane pulled him back down. The judge spent a long time looking through the documents, his face unreadable. Finally, he looked toward the back of the room. "I would like to hear from the children," the judge said softly. Brooks stood up first. He walked to the front of the room with a steady gait that reminded me of the way he watched me work in the garage. He did not look at Shane. He looked directly at me. That man left us in the rain," Brooks said, his voice small but clear. "He did not call us for 3 years. He did not know that I had a fever, and he did not know when I learned to read. My papa Jack was the one who was there. He is the one who fixes my toys and stays awake when I am scared of the dark. I do not want a penthouse. I want to stay with my papa." Ruby followed him. She did not sing today, but her voice carried the same resonance. "A father is not a person who gives you a silk dress once every 3 years, she said, her eyes filling with tears. "A father is the person who works until his hands bleed so you can have music lessons. I do not know the man in the suit. I only know the man who smells like gasoline and loves us more than himself. Please, do not make us leave him." I felt a tear escape and roll down my cheek, but I did not wipe it away. I looked at Shane, who was now staring at the floor, his confidence completely shattered. The truth had finally stripped away the gold paint. He was not a father. He was just a ghost who had tried to haunt us. I realized then that I had already won. Whether the judge ruled in my favor or not, I had earned the only title that ever mattered. I was their papa. I was the one who stayed, and that was a debt that Shane could never repay. The judge did not take long to deliver the final verdict. When the gavel struck the wooden bench, the sound echoed through the silent courtroom like a thunderclap, signaling the end of a long and bitter winter. The court granted me full legal and physical custody of Brooks and Ruby. The judge noted that the stability and love provided by a dedicated guardian outweighed the biological claims of a parent who had abandoned his responsibilities. I did not feel a surge of triumph or a need to boast. I simply felt the heavy, suffocating weight of 3 years finally lifting from my shoulders. I turned to look at Shane, but he was already moving toward the back exit. He did not look at his children. He did not look at me. He vanished into the crowded hallway, fleeing the city before the federal agents could catch up with his trail of broken promises and forged documents. I later heard he had crossed the border into Mexico, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a legacy of lies. We returned to our small apartment on the edge of Cleveland that evening. It was still the same cramped space with the peeling wallpaper and the staircase that creaked with every step. I did not have the $60,000 required to open a grand showroom with leather chairs and high ceilings. The iron box under my bed was nearly empty, containing only a few crumpled bills and a collection of receipts for school supplies and music lessons. My dream of Harrison & Sons auto repair in the way I had originally imagined it was gone. But as I watched Brooks and Ruby sitting on the floor sharing a cheap frozen pizza and laughing at a cartoon on the television, I realized that I was richer than I had ever been. A few days later, I arrived at Miller's garage at my usual time. The morning air was crisp, and the smell of old oil was as familiar to me as my own breath. I expected to find a stack of repair orders waiting for me, but instead I found Mr. Miller standing by the main entrance. He was holding a cardboard box and a new set of keys. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded toward the sign above the door. "Jack," he said, his voice as gravelly as the road outside, "I am getting old. My joints hurt when it rains, and I want to spend more time fishing in Lake Erie than I do under a dirty chassis. I have watched you for years. You are the best mechanic I have ever known, and you are a better man than I was at your age. I am not going to give you this shop because a man like you would not want a handout, but I am going to make you a partner. You will take over the daily operations, and over the next 5 years you will buy out my share from the profits. We are going to change the sign. It is time this place had a name that people can trust." He reached into his box and pulled out a small hand-painted wooden plaque. It did not say Miller's Garage. It said Miller and Harrison Family Auto Care. It was not the Grand Oak sign I had dreamed of in my head, but as I held it in my rough, scarred hands, it felt more valuable than gold. I realized that I did not need a shiny new building in a wealthy neighborhood. I had a place where I belonged, and I had a future that I had earned with my own sweat and blood. Brooks started helping me at the shop after school. He was too young to work on the engines, but he was excellent at organizing the tool chests and sweeping the bays. Ruby continued her music lessons, and the Coogan account I had established remained untouched, growing slowly as she performed at local events. She still sang in the back office of the garage, her voice soaring above the sound of the pneumatic wrenches, a constant reminder that beauty could thrive even in the grimiest of places. I have learned that the world is full of people like Shane people who think that success is measured by the car you drive or the suit you wear. They think that family is an obligation or a tool to be used. They are wrong. Family is not the blood that flows in your veins. It is not a name on a birth certificate or a face in an old photograph. Family is the person who stays when everyone else runs away. It is the person who is willing to sweat to sacrifice and to work until their bones ache just to ensure you are safe. It is the person who protects you from the storm, not the one who leaves you in the rain. We are the Harrisons, and we are built to last.